range of coast where that hurricane might make landfall. So rather than saying there's an entire 1,500 mile stretch of coast at risk, you might be able to issue a hurricane watch or even a hurricane warning for just a couple 100-mile stretch of coast. That's a vastly narrower stretch and results in a much better economic outcome. You don't force millions of people who didn't need to evacuate. You don't force tens of millions of people and the economies that they depend on to shut down. Also, in terms of losses averted, it means that you can bring in resources pre-positioned. You can bring in search and rescue crews preemptively. You can bring in utility repair crews preemptively. You can take actions to put up flood walls, to close storm shutters, to reduce the actual damage that's going to occur when that storm makes landfall. And so these are in the case of losses that you otherwise would have incurred, which could be in the many billions of dollars, that then didn't occur because we had an accurate weather prediction for that event. But there's also efficiencies gained, and a lot of those efficiencies gained occur or accrue when the weather is not so dramatic. Sometimes when it is, but often even when you just have an ordinary sunny day. And take this as an example. If you're taking a flight from San Francisco or Los Angeles to New York on a commercial airline, obviously those commercial airlines don't take the exact same route on every trip, and there are a number of reasons for that. There's air traffic control reasons, there are temporary flight restrictions that can exist. But one of the main reasons is the specific weather on the day you take that flight. And some of the diversions that occur are for safety, of course. You don't want to fly directly into a developing thunderstorm, or you don't want to fly through an area of extreme turbulence. Obviously, those are to be avoided at all costs. But there's also another thing that happens, which is that aircraft that fly roughly at the level of the jet stream, that river of high-velocity air in the upper atmosphere, 30,000 feet up or so, can actually be a really effective way to increase fuel efficiency, either by entering the jet stream on purpose, so essentially getting a 200-mile-an-hour tailwind is certainly going to increase your fuel efficiency, or if you're flying potentially in the opposite direction against that west to east flow of the jet stream, you're purposefully avoiding it. And the jet stream wiggles around a lot from day to day. Sometimes it can be as far south as San Diego, sometimes it's up in Alaska. So you really need to know day to day where the jet stream is in order to maximally, efficiently route your aircraft. So there's not even just the safety question, that's of course a critical one, but it is also an efficiency question, which means that the amount of fuel that's burned on a given trip is greatly affected by how good your weather forecasts are. That affects everything from the amount of fuel burned, which of course is going to affect the profit margins for the airlines. It also affects what the level of carbon emissions is from that flight. So pretty much everyone's incentives are actually aligned, in that case, to have a good weather forecast that allows an airline to route its aircraft both safely and efficiently, because there's really no downside to increasing safety and efficiency there. It has both economic and safety benefits for individual airlines and individual operators, and therefore for the economy in general. And there's any number of other efficiencies that can be gained there. Imagine even you order a package from a international mega corporation or your favorite local retailer. Well, either way, the distribution and logistics network to get those products from where they were produced to the distribution center to your home, all of that is dependent also on weather information, whether that's being shipped via ground or air or some other modality. Everything from the U.S. Postal Service to UPS to FedEx, everyone is using weather information to plan their day-to-day routes for efficiency and to make sure things get there on time. And say there's a disruption, say there's a major ice storm in central U.S., and there's often a lot of the freight cargo airports are often mid-continent. One of the more efficient ways to avoid a delay in your package getting delivered is to route that package through some other airport. So just an example of how just about everything you do day to day, whether or not you recognize it, if you get in the car and go on the freeway, the Department of Transportation, again, using weather data that mostly comes originally, at least it's in original form, from NOAA. We have a flight you better believe those airlines are using weather data produced, you guessed it, originally by NOAA. And you have these sort of, you go day by day, the more you recognize that there is, the on-the-ground realities that we all use these weather forecasts, whether we're directly looking at them or not. If you look at your smartphone weather app, well, guess where that data is coming from? It's coming from NOAA or the European partner agency, ECMWF. You look at the Weather Channel. Ultimately, that information is derived largely, again, from NOAA sources. So you can't escape it. And I think that's worth repeating over and over again right now, because I think that there's a notion in certain circles that there is in the private sector, so the weather companies like AccuWeather or the Weather Channel or all of these other meteorologically focused companies that exist in the U.S., that they exist in parallel to NOAA and the National Weather Service, independent of it. And the reality is, and this is essentially universally acknowledged, by the way, by these private weather companies, that ultimately NOAA is the backbone for all of this. It provides the foundational data networks, the foundational weather models themselves, that all of these other entities, the whole private sector relies upon for their day-to-day functioning. And the private sector does good work. They add real value to these NOAA products, and they offer things that NOAA doesn't have the resources or the capabilities to provide, which is the whole purpose of the enterprise, of course. But it's not something that is independent of NOAA. It is something that is in addition to, on top of, exists atop the superstructure of NOAA, and that freely available, taxpayer-funded weather and climate information that exists there, both the day-to-day operations of the Weather Service and the long-term research arm of NOAA that improves weather predictive capabilities, that improves also the ways in which weather forecasts reach people, so how to communicate and interpret those weather forecasts, and also the long-term climate projections, those climate models, to prepare for the future adequately, to make sure that our dams are capable of withstanding future floods, to make sure that our highways and railroads don't buckle under increasingly extreme heat. So all of this is critically important, and it's publicly funded. One of the key values of public funding for this is that not all of these key functions are something that you would be able to reasonably justify in a profit-driven capacity, so in the private sector. NOAA's mandate, and in particular the mandate of the National Weather Service, is to protect life and property. There isn't necessarily going to be a private sector incentive to do that at scale. Perhaps you have a subscription for severe weather warnings that might protect your life and your property. But who's going to do that for the masses, for the public at large? Probably not the private sector. In fact, there's reasons why, and I've spoken to several private sector CEOs in the weather space recently about this. Again, all of whom are in unanimous agreement about the critical importance of NOAA and the Weather Service, which is that there is not really any incentive, in fact, nor even an ability to provide these large-scale, life-saving weather predictive services, partly just as a function of legal liability. The Weather Service, responsible for issuing everything from flash flood warnings to tornado warnings to, as we saw in Los Angeles before the catastrophe in January, red flag warnings, or particularly dangerous situation red flag warnings in advance of truly historic extreme fire weather conditions. They are protected from liability as a government entity when they issue those warnings. You cannot sue the National Weather Service because they warned you, or because they gave you a false warning about something that didn't occur, nor can you sue them because they failed to warn. Say they missed a tornado. Obviously nobody wants that to happen, least of whom the folks who work at the Weather Service, but it can occasionally happen. But if it does, the individuals who are offering those warnings and the entity for which they work is not liable because it is a government entity. I won't go into the legal details since I'm far from a legal scholar here, But the reverse is not true for private entities. If, for example, it were intended that a private entity were to take over extreme weather warnings from the Weather Service for the public at large, again, this is different for individual subscribers. That's already something that exists today. But for the public at large, think about those emergency alerts you get on your phone during severe weather or during fire events. Those come originally from the National Weather Service. The private sector is not going to be inclined to issue those because, as the laws currently are written, if they take over that responsibility and they're warning the public at large, and they can potentially be held liable for warnings that are either false positives and cause, say, economic harm or something, or false negatives, where something bad happens and it wasn't warned for. So there is real concern in the private sector that this is something that would just simply go away. There would not be public safety-oriented, large-scale weather warnings anymore if the Weather Service were no longer had the mandate or the capability of issuing them. So that's a very real, immediate, practical implication of all of this. But the more important aspect here, well, maybe not the more important, but at least the more broadly and more immediately relevant aspect, is that NOAA still, even beyond that, is providing the backbone data capability. And by that I mean the collection of atmospheric weather data, whether this is from weather radar, Earth orbiting satellites, the thousands upon thousands of individual weather stations around the country. And by weather stations, I don't mean staffed offices with people in them. I literally mean these instrumentation towers that are mostly automated these days that stand out there anywhere from an airport in an urban area to a remote mountaintop or valley out there in the wilderness. All of that information gets funneled through NOAA. Not only do they build, maintain, and operate that infrastructure, but they also maintain that data archive. They are also responsible for ingesting all of that data, processing it, quality controlling it, and then archiving it and using it in ingestion processes for these weather predictive models. You need to know what the atmosphere looks like right now to predict the atmosphere at some future point. So NOAA does that in the United States, and other countries rely on NOAA, that data that comes from NOAA, for their own weather predictions. I was speaking yesterday with a journalist who was really concerned about the effects even that what's going on at NOAA have in other countries. So not only is this important for Americans, and it is chiefly important for Americans living in the United States, it is also critically important from a global perspective because of the global role that NOAA plays in collecting atmospheric data, processing it, assimilating it, and also in producing and disseminating these global weather predictions, as well as global climate projections. So suffice it to say, this is just, the world we live in is made better by the fact that we have freely available, highly accurate weather forecasts, and the fact that we have these local Weather Service field offices wherever you live in the country. So wherever you happen to be listening from today, there is a local Weather Service office with meteorologists on staff 24/7, 365 days a year, who are keeping an eye on the radar screen, keeping an eye on the telephone lines, to make sure no one's calling in anything alarming, to protect your life and property. And that is something that is seriously at risk in this moment. The ability for these folks to continue to do their jobs. What we've seen so far are cuts on the order of 10% to NOAA and the Weather Service. And these cuts were reductions in staff, essentially forced firings of people who were primarily probationary employees. And just to remind folks, probationary does not mean that they were in trouble or poor performing. Probationary in this context, and this is true of virtually all federal employees, mainly means that they were either relatively recent hires within the past 1 to 3 years. It's been widely reported that it's people hired within the past year, but it's actually a lot longer than that in some positions, as many as 3 years. I've been talking to people recently who were fired who had 2 to 3 years of experience but were still considered quote-unquote probationary. And it also includes, even more ironically, some of the most experienced senior staff in some of these agencies, because it's the people who recently received large promotions to a new job title, to a new elevated leadership role within these organizations, who are now newly probationary because they've only been in that new promoted role due to their excellent performance for 1 to 3 years. So we've lost preferentially 2 classes of people at NOAA and the Weather Service in recent weeks. A lot of the relatively newer hires who were brought in to fill critical staffing gaps. Much of the Weather Service was considered to be understaffed, or even locally critically understaffed. There had been some hiring in the past year or so to try and rectify that, and we suddenly got rid of almost all of those people who were filling. So now we're back to critical understaffing at an even greater number of offices. But also, some of the most experienced people who had the most knowledge of these organizations and how things work, and had been promoted because of their excellent knowledge and performance over years and even decades, those too were the other class of people who were fired. So we got rid of almost the 2 classes of people who are really working to make these organizations more efficient. The people who were brought in to fill gaps, and the people who were best performing and in some cases most senior. So that's certainly not something that increases the efficiency of an organization. Let's be clear about that. But the other thing that's more concerning even than this, these 10% reductions have already had significant impacts, and I can enumerate them a little bit more in a moment. But the greater concern, and this is shared by every NOAA and Weather Service employee I've spoken with, both those who were fired and those who remain, although very few of these folks are willing to go on the record speaking with journalists right now, which I feel is highly concerning and a rather strong statement unto itself. But there's almost universal concern.
The Hercules 20-volt platform from Harbor Freight is battle-tested and ready to help you power through the toughest jobs. Hercules goes toe-to-toe with the big brands, but
dangerous cuts already seen fraction are perhaps only. Again, we are talking about over 10% cuts to NOAA. There are again, we are talking about highly credible rumors that the plan is for highly credible 30 to the 50% cut. That's 50. So a full halving of funding and staffing, or even more in some cases. If that were to happen, that would be essentially a decapitation strike against the Weather Service and NOAA. The cuts on that order would essentially mean that the organizations cease to function consistent with their mandate to protect life and property. They just would not be able to continue to do that. Certainly not with any reliability, and perhaps at all. Now again, that hasn't happened yet, but I think this is the moment to be talking about the consequences if it does, because it's going to be too late to stop it if it actually takes place. So now is the moment to voice your support for NOAA and the Weather Service, and to understand and to have conversations about why it's so critically important, not only a very good use of taxpayer funds by most objective quantitative metrics, but also why I think many folks don't realize how truly irreplaceable it is. There is no private weather sector that can spin up to replace the Weather Service and NOAA on any rapid basis. And by that I mean within the next few years, there is nothing that could possibly be spun up to replace NOAA or the Weather Service. In the very long run, I highly doubt that's truly the case either, but it's certainly almost instantaneously. The plan, as of now, involves cuts that would essentially be implemented as rapidly as the 10% cuts were a couple of weeks ago. And just to illustrate how rapid those were, people were told they had an hour to clear out their desk when they were fired from NOAA and the Weather Service a couple weeks ago. So this is tremendously alarming. And that's on the operational side of things, meaning the weather predictive side. There have been further major cuts on the communication side, so people who interpret weather forecasts and talk about climate and climate change. Some of my colleagues at climate.gov, who wrote, for example, the incredible and excellent ENSO blog, were fired. So that was one of the most lean and effective public communication tools that NOAA had developed in recent years. I've repeatedly remarked on just how remarkable it was that a public agency was doing something so worthwhile with so few staff, and that was one of the very first things to be decimated. Climate research. I know people who do excellent climate research at NOAA's GFDL, the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, co-located with Princeton University. Massive cuts there. People who were doing cutting-edge weather and climate modeling research, whose research has just been abruptly terminated. They can't even wrap up their projects because they've lost computing access. These people have scientific papers under review that are going to have to be retracted because they can't finish up the work. They can't respond to reviewers because they no longer have access to their code, no longer have access to their data set or their computer. So just all of that money, all of that investment over years, frozen and wasted because people aren't able to finish their jobs, not even able to wrap them up. So that is what we've already seen with the 10% cuts. What would it look like to see 30 to 50%? I think that's the real concern, because I think that what we're seeing now, there's a strong sense that it's just the beginning unless there's a significant course correction. And I sincerely hope there will be, because the consequences of these cuts we're already seeing. There are already offices that are understaffed. There are already locations where radiosondes, so those balloons that have atmospheric instrumentation attached to them, that are critically important in providing those initial condition data for accurate weather predictions. There's now no longer anybody staffing the locations to launch them in some locations, including Alaska, for example, which is actually preferentially important because, of course, much of the weather over the continental and contiguous U.S. Comes from the Pacific and goes east. So this is a critical zone. Now we don't have that information. Certain radar sites, it's a little bit hard to verify some of these rumors because there are very few people still employed within the Weather Service who are speaking on the record with journalists. But there are indications that purchasing freezes and credit card purchasing freezes and lack of staffing by radar technicians is preventing the timely repair of radar domes, radar sites when they go down. And these are critical pieces of weather instrumentation that do tend to break down relatively frequently. They have a lot of moving parts and a lot of complex electronics, so they do require a lot of ongoing maintenance and repairs, but it's gotten really difficult to do that suddenly since these cuts were implemented. And one of the more dramatic, I think, consequences of this that I was just made aware of yesterday is when it comes to the looming hurricane season. So, of course, we start to see hurricanes that can form in the Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico starting around May or June each year. Is that the U.S. Hurricane Hunter Force, the personnel cuts there mean that we are one bout of food poisoning or influenza away from not having the ability to investigate hurricanes with these critically important weather reconnaissance flights, because they're now down to a skeleton crew. There is zero redundancy now. They have fired every single overlapping position, such that now if one person is unavailable on these crews, they cannot safely or legally fly planes. So there's a very possibility that if one of these critical flight officers or pilots or meteorologists who fly on these flights get a bad summer cold during hurricane season, we won't be able to fly those planes into those storms and sample them reliably enough. And this could have immediately life-threatening consequences if there happens to be a potentially rapidly strengthening hurricane off the coast of Miami or Houston or New Orleans or somewhere else along the eastern seaboard of the Gulf of Mexico, because we often have weather models that are not so good at predicting those unless there's really frequent updates in situ sampling from these Hurricane Hunter aircraft. We can't get that information from weather stations or satellites or weather radar. These aircraft really are the only way to get it. And so while the program itself has not been cut, although I do wonder what would happen at a 30 to 50% cut level, we are already with these 10% cuts at the point where if there's any operational anomalies, which includes somebody just becoming ill before a flight, that we would be unable to have those sampling flights at critically needed moments. So I think that's probably enough on what the stakes are and what the consequences are in a more tangible sense when it comes to weather and climate science, and just how deeply all of that is integrated into our own day-to-day lives. But now I did want to reflect a little bit on transitioning toward a more actionable side of things for folks who are in the audience who are weather or climate scientists or wildfire scientists, or really anybody in adjacent fields, or thinking of getting into these fields, or perhaps current students. Maybe you're an undergraduate, maybe you're studying atmospheric science, maybe you're a PhD student or just received a PhD, maybe you're a postdoc. So there's all of these different levels of secondary and post-secondary education. And I'm speaking to all of you in this context because I think similar advice applies. I realize this is a challenging moment for all of you, and I've been receiving a lot of requests for advice on what to do. You know, is it worth pursuing a degree at this point in these fields? What do I do now that I have this degree and I'm on the job market and it looks like it's imploding right now, at least in the public sector? Or in some cases, I just lost my job because I was a federal employee who is no longer employed by the federal government suddenly, and for no fault of my own. Or, in even more cases, people have been contacting me because they're in the private sector in this space, but these are companies that have contracted with the federal government, and those federal contracts have been summarily dismissed with no warning and in contravention, in many cases, of the contractual agreement itself. Regardless of where people are in this space, I have some thoughts. I think this is a genuinely challenging moment because the problem is that in the United States, a large fraction of those historically who had weather and climate and wildfire-related expertise were historically employed by the federal government, either through the many branches of NOAA, or in terms of its research arms, or the Weather Service, or satellite agencies. And by satellite agencies, I suppose in this context I may mean literally agencies that operate satellites, or sort of in a more figurative sense, agencies that are peripherally related to weather and climate prediction, either on the data side, instrumentation side, or etc. And further, a lot of people who were contractors to the federal government, who worked for private companies or even independent consultants themselves, but were still essentially paid by the federal government to do work on behalf of the American people and on behalf of the government. So we're still acting as de facto public servants, even if they weren't technically public employees. And the balance has suddenly shifted. There are still, of course, many thousands of people employed by the public sector in this capacity in the United States, and I hope they continue to be so. But with the additional looming 30 to 50% threat of additional 30 to 50% cuts, I think this does pose a deeper question about what the viability of careers in the public sector in the space actually look like. And I don't have any clear answers because I don't know really better than anybody else whether or not those 30 to 50% additional cuts are actually going to transpire. Already, I think it's pretty clear that there are near zero prospects for new hiring of weather, climate, or fire scientists in the government, in the federal government, for the foreseeable future. So unfortunately, I think if you do not currently have one of those roles, it's unlikely you'll be able to get one for probably at least a year or so. I won't speculate beyond that for now, but I think in the short term, the prospect of becoming a newly hired federal employee in the space is to be quite frank, very low. I hope that as many people who have those roles now are able to keep those jobs. But if that's not an option, what are the alternatives? Well, there is a burgeoning private sector, as I mentioned, and there has long been a private weather sector, although it used to be smaller. It used to be relegated to a relatively small number of not very big companies that either did sort of public-facing weather, so think of companies like the Weather Channel or now the Weather Company, or AccuWeather, or a number of private weather prediction companies that produced essentially tailored meteorological products for different end users, so agricultural interests or airlines or logistics companies, whatever the context might be, energy, for example, power production. Those still exist and have actually grown quite a bit. So that is a sector where there are potential opportunities for people who have backgrounds in data or meteorology. But there's also a growing private sector when it comes to climate and wildfire. And this is something that did not really exist a decade ago. When I was getting my PhD, in the climate world, you pretty much were planning to become a public employee of some sort, because that's where all the climate work was being done. That's not necessarily the case exclusively anymore. And there are actual companies, both from startup level and now more established companies, all around the country and all around the world, that do both weather and climate science. Uh, and in many cases, these are in some form or another connected to risk prediction or projection or assessment. So a lot of these companies are either uh, working with insurance providers or reinsurers in many cases, or are in fact, these jobs are actually in insurance and reinsurance companies to begin with. In fact, in trying to connect as many federal employees as I can to new jobs in the last couple of weeks, most of the jobs that are available right now in this space are in fact in insurance and reinsurance companies, and also in these newer startup type entities that are providing services to those sectors in the weather, climate, and wildfire space. And within that, there are individual companies now that are specializing in mapping and projecting and modeling wildfire, for example, or specific types of weather hazards. There are companies focused on flood risk modeling, specifically, for example, or even severe convective weather, thunderstorms and hail and tornadoes. These kinds of companies really didn't used to exist at the scale that they now do, and I think that is comparatively good news in this moment, because it means that even though the federal government may not be uh, uh, adequately responding to the societal need right now and offering those jobs, some of them do exist in the private sector. Uh, Many of them do require advanced degrees, so most of these kinds of jobs that I've just mentioned require at least master's degrees in relevant fields, and in some cases, either PhD or a master's plus a lot of years of experience. That does limit opportunities for some people in the insurance and reinsurance space. But there are other roles in sort of data science support roles that do not necessarily require those advanced degrees. And there are also a lot of jobs in the weather sector, these private weather companies that are providing tailored predictions, even still using, of course, as I mentioned, a lot of NOAA backbone data. But those don't necessarily require the advanced degrees in the same way. So generally speaking, you do need some sort of science degree in a relevant field, whether that's atmospheric science, or environmental science, or civil engineering, or ecology if it's wildfires. There's a number of different fields, physical science, biological science, and engineering, that will qualify you for a lot of the jobs that are out there now, or that I think might begin to pop up as some companies opportunistically try and scoop up some of the tremendous expertise that is currently and unexpectedly on the job market all at once. So, first, just a note of comparative optimism. I am seeing jobs out there, and it's a little bit hard to connect sometimes with the relevant folks, but I am seeing those opportunities arise, especially for folks with advanced degrees, but also in many cases, for those without. Where are the resources to find these? Well, some of it is a bit ad hoc, I will admit, but the American Meteorological Society and the American Geophysical Union have both opened up their online career centers even to non-members and have waived membership fees even for those who have been longtime members who have recently lost their jobs. So that is one good place to look. It should be open to everybody, and that covers a pretty wide range. American Meteorological Society, of course, more weather and climate directly. American Geophysical Union, a much broader umbrella in the earth sciences generally and engineering fields. But I also would recommend, as much as I have not been a particular fan or active on LinkedIn, it has proven to be a very useful tool in trying to help connect people with new job opportunities and new potential employers. So I would strongly suggest that anybody who's currently on the market, whether you're just a student who's going to graduate soon or somebody who's recently lost their job, do get on LinkedIn and connect and go through the motions of updating your profile and connecting with everybody you know. Because it really does seem like that is where a lot of potential employers and recruiters are, and it is much easier to stumble upon potential opportunities there. In fact, I am being contacted by a lot of CEOs and recruiters there right now, asking me to connect them with people who might be qualified for X or Y job opportunity. And the easiest way for me to do that is to just plop someone's LinkedIn profile directly into a message on the same platform. So I would strongly suggest, whether or not you're active on social media elsewhere, if you are looking for a job or think you might be shortly, it's a good time to establish a presence there, even if you only use it for job-related purposes, which is ostensibly its primary purpose. I'm not very active there as a social media site, but I do think it's helpful
Shower, please
for
use soap. Just don't stand under the
job-related
water.
things.
I do.
Well, your soap
And
hasn't been going
the
down.
other
and use your
question, I
deodorant.
think, is, okay, what about students?
No, use your deodorant every day.
What about going into these fields? And that's a difficult question right now, because right now the job market has contracted in
Just standing under the
weather
water
space
will clean.
especially, but also in the climate and in the climate space.
What kind of soap do you use?
I'm not so
I use
sure
the
that
blue one.
the job market has really contracted when it comes to the wildfire-related space, because there is so much active hiring in the private sector right now. Will that private sector availability saturate as more and more people enter the market, either due to further staffing reductions in the public sector? It is likely that the availability will eventually saturate in all of these fields, because there are far more public employees losing their jobs right now than there are private sector openings. Even as companies, I think, sort of opportunistically add a few new jobs to pick up as many people as they can, there isn't really as large of an industry as there is a public sector for this, and that is going to be a critical gap. My fear is that it means a lot of people with societally useful, highly specialized expertise may be forced for practical reasons, because you gotta pay the rent, you gotta have health insurance, to do other things, to do different jobs other than what they were trained to do or would rather be doing. Jobs that may not be public serving, if you will. The first thing I wanted to say is, if you got to do that, there certainly is no shame in that, and don't feel bad about it. If you're lucky, you might even be paid more, because a lot of the people I know who've recently made the jump, or are planning to from the public sector to the private sector, are actually seeing huge pay increases. Some of whom will probably end up providing some of the same services back to the federal government, ultimately through contracts at much greater expense to the government than had they just continued to be employed by the government directly. But that's a slightly different issue. I'm glad that they're able to continue doing what they're doing. I'm glad that they're able to provide that expertise. But also, if you gotta go do something else, there's genuinely no shame in that, and there is a lot of benefit that can come from applying skills in weather and climate and wildfire and just general science and data analysis and scientific thinking in different fields anyway. We certainly need it in any number of places, and there are generalizable scientific skills, how you think about addressing problems, asking and answering questions, communicating to the wider world. How do you have these conversations with wider audiences? All of those are valuable skills that you can apply in other settings, and many people will. I'm hoping that we don't lose too much expertise through attenuation because I think that it takes a long time to obtain that level of education and on-the-ground experience and just domain-specific knowledge. You can't get it overnight. We desperately need it as a society, and if those folks go on to do other things, certainly no blame to them individually, but as a society, we are losing something, I think. The other opportunity / challenge here is that other countries are very interested in taking advantage of what they might consider American brain drain. There is active hiring in Europe and Canada and China and Australia that is currently aimed, and by public sector, by the way, by governments and research organizations in all of those countries, aimed at picking up some of this expertise that the U.S. has decided it doesn't want in this moment. And that is potentially a great opportunity for some people to go work in another country, continue to be a public sector, public serving scientist in some capacity somewhere in the world, providing that knowledge and that expertise in a similar domain relevant context. If that's an option for you, and that would be true of universities and governments, some of whom are specifically now offering programs targeted toward U.S. scientists who have lost their jobs or will not, or scientists who are newly minted graduates, for example, and won't be able to find a public sector job in the near term. That is going to be an emerging option too. So obviously, living in a different country is not an option for everybody, perhaps not even for most folks, but it will be an option for some, and it could be a good one for some. And that's a great way to make sure that all of your hard work and domain-specific expertise is used in a constructive way still. It does mean that there probably will be loss of expertise from the U.S. and attenuation, but I suppose that's a bit of a self-inflicted wound, so as long as the world continues to benefit, that's probably still a net positive thing. In terms of whether or not people should pursue degrees in this space, I think the challenge is that, as I mentioned, the market right now is going to be a real challenge, the job market in the U.S. If you have an undergraduate degree at like a Bachelor's of Science in Atmospheric Science, one of the pipelines, in fact, what I originally thought I was likely going to do, by the way, many years ago, was become a National Weather Service meteorologist with a qualifying degree from a public university. I got that degree. I have that degree, that Bachelor of Science in Atmospheric Science, which is the basic degree required to become a National Weather Service meteorologist, using criteria that are defined by the American Meteorological Society. Obviously, I did not pursue that path. I've done other things in the climate world and the weather world, but that, I think, is going to be a much more difficult trajectory. And I think a much greater fraction of folks in atmospheric science and related fields are going to have to think about other opportunities to pivot, whether that's becoming a private sector meteorologist, and there will be a growing number of those roles, although they are, the pipeline to them is not as obvious in some cases. And the options will also be to use those skills, those data analysis, those critical thinking and communication skills in a different capacity, either temporarily or in the long run, as you wait for the conditions to change. Those with advanced degrees or who are actively pursuing them, I absolutely think it's worth continuing to pursue them and to finish your degree. This is not a good reason, I think, to drop out of your degree program. I think that would be probably a big mistake for the vast majority of people who are considering it. So I would advise folks not to necessarily change their degrees, not to shift their focus away from weather or climate or fire, but to just think differently about what you're going to do next with that degree. Don't assume, if you're getting a PhD, that you're going to be hired as a professor somewhere. That has always been a bit of a long shot, even in the best of times, but it certainly is a long shot now. Don't assume that with your bachelor's degree in atmospheric science, you're going to be able to get an entry-level National Weather Service meteorology role. But also, don't stop those processes. Don't interrupt your passion or your inclination towards public service, towards helping people and making the world a better place through your science just because the job market has shifted. I think there are opportunities, but they're going to be different than what they were. It is going to be totally honest, a challenging job market in the space for the foreseeable future, But I also think from this will likely emerge a more robust private sector for a lot of these spaces. There are many startups, so these new small companies using machine learning and AI techniques to do things in the weather, climate, and fire space. That is in fact a huge growth sector right now. There are a tremendous number of companies like this. And by the way, this is a space that I engage in more frequently as well. I am still fundamentally employed as a public sector scientist. My employer is the University of California through its Agricultural and Natural Resources division these days. But I also engage pretty extensively now on the private sector side of things. I'm an advisor to a number of companies, one of which, again, is one of the sponsors of this YouTube channel, Reask. And I did ask them, by the way, if they were doing any active hiring. They are based primarily in Europe, and they're unfortunately not doing any mass hiring at the moment, but they're always interested, by the way, in highly qualified candidates in the weather and climate risk modeling space. So it might still be worth a try. Another piece of advice, sometimes cold emails can work, and you can often find people's contact information on LinkedIn, even if it's not available elsewhere. But I advise a number of companies right now. Inigo Insurance on wildfire, and Reask on all sorts of modeling, Climate Check, for example, on climate risk assessment and other topics. And so I do think it's increasingly important to engage with the private sector, even if you are a public sector scientist or a university scientist, as I am in my current capacity, because the world is changing. There are strengthening public-private partnerships. And I think one of the ironies in all of this is I actually think that that's a good thing. I think there probably should have been better connections between the public and private sector to begin with. So in all of this debate about privatizing everything, is there a kernel of truth there? I think there probably is. I do not think we're going about it in an appropriate or efficient way, but I do think that there are real opportunities for growth there, and that there's nothing inherently bad about jumping back and forth between the public and private sector. In fact, I think some of the folks who do the most good in both worlds probably do have a foot in both doors, as it were, wearing multiple hats. So I'm trying to do more of that myself as well, because I do think it's constructive and it helps build this bridge, especially in this moment where we really need it. So I realize I've gone past the hour, but I knew this one was probably going to run a little bit long. So I want to take a look at the questions now. And so I will start from the beginning, go chronologically through the live chat, and then as they come in, this gives people a last-minute opportunity to add some additional questions at the end, which I'll get to, again, in chronological order. So just give me a moment to take a sip of water. And again, thank you everybody for joining. And just to remind everybody that this is an event that is informally associated with the Stand Up for Science events and rallies all around the country today. There is a major national rally in Washington, D.C. that is going on right now. It started about an hour ago, but is expected to last several hours. So you can, if you're local, you can check it out, or there's probably going to be some news coverage. But there's also dozens, if not hundreds, of other rallies around the world and certainly around the country that are mostly going to begin between 10 and noon local time. So some of those might be beginning soon or will begin imminently. So I just wanted to have this session before most of the events on the West Coast. We're going to begin later. There are also walkouts at research labs and university around the country, even if there isn't necessarily an organized event. So I would encourage folks to participate just for the sake of solidarity and also just for the visibility of these sorts of events. And I think also, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's okay to stand up for science and also acknowledge that is not the only thing that matters. And I think it's important to stand up for things beyond science as well, and to stand for things in general. But in this moment, this is what I can do today in my own domain, I think, most effectively. Okay, let's take a look at these questions here. There's a few comments of people who are headed up to different rallies. There's several comments about the San Francisco one today. By the way, I did include a link at the beginning of the chat section where you can find where they're actually occurring in your neck of the woods. I think that's an Al Roker phrase. one of the big national meteorologists on the morning shows. Anyway, the weather in your neighborhood, in your neck of the woods. Maybe I'm conflating a few different people. All right, thank you for the kind words, folks. You know, one of the questions from a few different people I'm seeing is sort of like, well, isn't this sort of preaching to the choir? You're talking to weather and about the importance of weather and climate on a weather and climate channel to people who tune in for weather and climate broadcasts, and I do realize that. I'm fully cognizant of that, but I do think that the details here are important, partly because all of you can act potentially as emissaries of this knowledge and information and these perspectives in your own daily lives, and this was already true when it comes to weather and climate science, that most people say they never hear about climate change in their daily conversations. So use all of what I've said today in your conversations with people when you go to the coffee shop or the grocery store or you meet with family and friends. That's one of the ways to have a multiplicative effect right off the bat. Folks mentioning they're going to different University of California events later today. There's a question from Mia. Is the FAA, so the Federal Aviation Administration, also reliant on the National Weather Service data, or do they have their own systems in place? It's a mix of both. FAA does operate, for example, terminal weather radars, so weather radars located specifically at major airports to aid in helping the pilots avoid things like thunderstorm downdrafts and wind shear, which can be very dangerous upon approach and landing. So there is some redundancy, but ultimately, when it comes to weather forecasts, the FAA does not really do their own weather modeling, for example. So this is still something that comes ultimately from NOAA, and that NOAA backbone of the global forecast system, or these data assimilations. The FAA does have some in-house meteorological expertise and some instrumentations at airports specifically, but of course you need to know what's happening in between airports because that's where airplanes are actually flying, and that is not something that the FAA directly has additional sources for. So all of this does largely come back to NOAA, even though in some targeted ways the FAA does operate its own infrastructure, which, by the way, I will mention that the cuts at the FAA have preferentially been in many cases, the technicians that maintain the physical infrastructure for air traffic control and, yes, things like the terminal weather radar. So exactly the kinds of instrumentation that they do maintain have also been at the FAA the subject of cuts there, in addition to the ones at NOAA. Yeah, and there's just a couple of examples beyond what I just mentioned about how cuts at different departments are actually interconnected. And of course they are in so many ways, and so the effects are sometimes cumulative. And, you know, there have been some legal actions that have maybe temporarily restored some of these jobs. Not in NOAA, though, by the way. I don't know of a single person at NOAA or the Weather Service or the U.S. Geological Survey wildfire teams that have been rehired despite the legal actions, despite the headlines about rehiring. In these specific domains, I am not yet aware of a single person who has been rehired despite these court orders. So I don't know if that will change, and even if it does, there is this greater concern about what might happen following the next congressional appropriations bill, which is very likely to decimate some of these agencies through further funding and, unfortunately, make legal challenges much harder when it comes to the cuts to come. A lot of the legal challenges that have happened so far, by the way, have been essentially along the lines of the entities and the people who have been ordering the cuts didn't have the authority to do so. It's up to the individual agency heads themselves. Well, what is likely to happen in the coming weeks is that as this shutdown, the government shutdown looms, as it likely happens, and then is eventually, presumably resolved, when there is a new congressional appropriations bill, when there is a new government funding bill, essentially, that funding bill is expected to dramatically reduce funding for these agencies, which will essentially force those agency heads to make the cuts, thereby obviating the legal challenges that the agency heads were not the ones doing the cuts. It will essentially force their hand and say, well, we have to cut staff and equipment on a level commensurate with the new budget. That is sort of the expectation of when these mass further cuts might emerge. So we're looking at anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months when we have that new appropriations bill. That's sort of my expectation for when that might happen. Yeah, and there's a couple of comments about how for folks who are thinking of continuing their degrees, or starting their degree, or finishing their degree, there is the funding challenge. And of course, most advanced degrees like science PhDs are usually not paid for out of pocket because very few of us have $500,000 in cash lying around to pay for one. But they're often funded by, you often receive a stipend and your tuition is covered. It's not a particularly lavish stipend, but it's usually enough to live on marginally. By the universities themselves, and those universities in turn are usually getting that funding from some public sector entity, so from NASA, NOAA, the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes for Health, whatever it is, whatever the field is. That's where a lot of that funding comes from, and a lot of it's been frozen. So a lot of programs are not admitting new students right now, which obviously would directly affect your ability to pursue a new degree. And it is possible that they will be dropping some existing students, although I know that's a last resort. They're going to try and keep people who are already in the program as much as possible. That is a real challenge that the federal grants, and this may end up being true at the undergraduate level as well, certain kinds of scholarships, Pell Grants, it's unclear what's going to happen to all of these. So I realize that presents major practical challenges, and I don't have any obvious solutions to this right now, other than I hope that the big private universities that have these massive multi-billion-dollar endowments, by the way, this is a good use of those endowments. If there were ever a rainy day, this is it. And I realize that that's easier said than done, and that these institutions are in some ways very financially, fiscally conservative, internally at least. But really, I hope that universities are able to find creative solutions to this, to continue offering the support that they would have offered to the students who need it, all the way from undergraduate to postgraduate level. The other thing I found, and by the way, I've been in conversations with multiple private philanthropic funders recently, is there may be an emergence or re-emergence of private philanthropy as a major source for funding of scientific education and careers. That has been a pretty sparse, slim pickings for a number of years, and that may be changing. The folks I'm talking with, they don't have the budgets to bankroll, NSF or NIH or anything like that. But the conversations are starting to get interesting, and I do think that there will be more private foundations offering more money to more people to do a wider range of things than has historically been the case in the past. So do keep your eyes peeled for those kinds of opportunities, all the way from private philanthropy-based undergraduate educational scholarships all the way up to postdoctoral fellowships, or even matched funding opportunities, for example, for a scientific career at a university, perhaps taking the place of what might have historically been an NSF grant or a grant from NOAA or NASA or something like that. Checking out the questions coming in here. Yeah, Marty mentions the commercial real estate industry is going through a big transition where we're starting to incorporate property resilience assessments into due diligence. new standards of technology and essentially building codes, insurance tie-ins, all that's happening. A lot of that's what's driving this surge in the private sector. Analytics, weather, climate, wildfire, risk assessment, insurance, reinsurance space. So that will be a growth industry, which is the good news for folks looking for a job anyway, and hopefully for the real estate sector as well. So just to be clear, Charles mentions that all the probationary employees were temporarily rehired. That is not correct, unfortunately. In fact, again, I am not aware of any probationary employees at NOAA, specifically, or the USGS, who have been rehired. There have been some rehirings in some agencies, but to my knowledge, that has not extended to NOAA at all. Certainly nobody I personally know who has been fired, and that list is now in the high double digits. None of them have been rehired as of when I started this live stream a little over an hour ago. Alright, well, it looks like I need to do a little bit of quick moderation here. Just give me a minute. Alright, let's see here. Flexibility is the name of the game. I often say that in the climate change adaptation world, and that might be the case here too, in terms of the job market for scientists. By the way, if there's any employers in the audience, which there well may be, I would also encourage flexibility on the behalf of potential employers. There's a lot of people who are going to jump at even relatively low-paid opportunities right now if they are remote in nature, so that people don't have to suddenly relocate unexpectedly when they've lost their place-based jobs on short notice. It's very difficult for people to uproot. One very cheap way for companies to acquire excellent talent right now is to offer remote roles that do not require relocation to a new place for that highly sought-after domain expert. That is, in many people's view, worth quite a bit, and does not really cost companies. I assure you that everybody I know in science can work just as effectively remotely. There, with some exceptions, of course. Some things are inherently place-based. You can't fix the radar from remotely, but generally speaking, on the analysis side and the science side, I really hope that employers reverse their stance on butts in seats in offices for everybody, because it's really limiting your pool of potential highly qualified employees. Let me just put it that way. Yeah, so just to be clear, those emails have not been rescinded. Those very inflammatory, false, and insulting emails that were sent to many of these federal government employees, to my knowledge, everybody I've spoken to, they received that one email telling them they were fired due to poor performance, which was not true, and that was it. There's been absolutely no follow-up since then with everyone I've spoken to. Does the University of California get a lot of federal money? Yes, it does, and there are currently lots of discussions. I've been getting lots of emails from different UC campuses, UC A&R, the Office of the President. There's huge uncertainty, and there is fear that there could be mass cuts to come that would force program closings, department closings even, certainly culling of staff, so nobody really knows what's going to happen. There's just tremendous uncertainty right now. there's a question from Brensky. What impacts to the WERT and BEAR teams? BEAR is the Burned Area Emergency Response, I think. I don't exactly know what the WERT acronym is for, but anyway, do you expect to see, what impact do you expect to see with the reliance on the Weather Service? Info, thanks for all you do. There could be real impacts. One place where we're already seeing impacts is that due to staffing reductions among meteorologists in the Weather Service, the IMETs, the Incident Meteorologist teams, where local meteorologists get dispatched to things like wildfires or other major incidents around the country to provide on-site support, that ability is going to be greatly limited this year now, because there simply isn't any redundancy in the system. No offices can really afford to send people because they need them back at home because the staffing is so critically low. So we may not see the availability of IMETs, incident meteorologists. I don't know specifically about what data availability for different programs might look like, but for example, the program, the mapping team that provides snowpack estimates in the western U.S. has been entirely cut, and they have about a few months of runway before that program goes completely dark. So we will no longer have in situ information about snowpack in the mountains. So good luck if we want to know what the flood risk is or what the water supply is going to look like at scale. In California, it's a bit different. The Department of Water Resources at the state level has some resources to monitor this. But throughout the rest of the West, this was a USDA federal enterprise. They cut that team, and we're not going to know what the snowpack looks like unless they're reinstated, for example. So, yes, probably there will be impacts. Yeah, folks, when you see folks who are disruptive in the chat, just as a general rule, or might be trolling, it is always better to ignore or block them. Please don't engage, because it really disrupts the chat section. There's a comment that the National Institutes of Health cap on indirect costs. That's a bit of a topic. For those who aren't already in the know, it's essentially federal grants provide a lot of the day-to-day operational resources used to literally keep the lights on and maintain facilities at universities. The NIH essentially said that they were going to stop paying like 80% of that, which is hugely consequential. NIH being the National Institutes of Health, which is where a lot of the university funding comes from in general, there is concern that this would extend to other agencies. I believe a federal judge this week ordered a temporary stay on that, but that there were other legal decisions pending that would reverse it. So again, tremendous uncertainty, and at this point, most universities are operating the assumption of dramatic funding cuts to come, either due to what's already happened or what is anticipated to occur. There's a comment, did I comment on the potential effects on hurricane preparedness? I did specifically address that earlier in the session, so if you want to go refer back to that, you can. The recording will be available shortly after I push the stop button on the live stream. You can go back and check that out. Usually YouTube generates an auto transcript too that's searchable, so you should be able to find it pretty quickly. Okay, so the acronym I didn't know earlier, the WERT, W-E-R-T, is the California Watershed Emergency Response Team. So I think the same logic applies there. All right, well, folks, I think we're past the hour. Thanks for continuing to join me for this extended special session in recognition of the Stand Up for Science events all around the country today. I encourage you to participate if you can, but thanks for joining this virtual session. And, you know, I will continue to talk primarily about weather and climate as it unfolds on this channel. But I do think this is a critical moment to have this broader conversation right now about science, its role in society and beyond. And it's not just a question of scientists clamoring for more science funding, but it really is a reckoning, I think, on just how important all of this is in our own day-to-day lives, whether people recognize it or not. And I would offer this in closing: the fact that many of us don't notice the importance of weather and climate science, don't quite have to interact on a day-to-day basis with the National Weather Service, don't have to actively seek out that information, is actually a sign of how successfully it's been integrated into our society, how effectively it's working. In many places in the world, you have to really seek out weather information. Things happen without warning because there isn't a national backbone that's publicly subsidized to provide high-quality weather information to everybody, regardless of where they are or their ability to pay for it. We just take that so much for granted because it's just ubiquitous. It just sort of is in the air that we breathe all around us. It's integrated into our daily lives. And let's not take that for granted, because that does not exist everywhere. And one sign of a well-functioning government agency is one that gives you benefits every single day, and you never have to think about it. Who wants to think about it? Think of all the interactions we have with the government that are, I guess you would call them high friction. Who enjoys going to the DMV office to renew their driver's license? Who enjoys getting on the phone with the IRS when you have a question about your taxes in March or April? I don't really think anybody enjoys that. There's still agencies that provide important public services, but they're not particularly beloved organizations. And why is that? It's mainly because they're high friction interactions. It's never smooth. They always have long lines, or you have to wait forever to get an answer that isn't quite what you want. That's not how the Weather Service works. It's just there, operating in the background. It gets you what you want and what you need without you even having to ask for it. But I think is actually a sign of a very well-functioning government entity. And I sure hope that it continues to be the case that our interaction with the Weather Service continues to provide that critical benefit in alignment with its mandate to protect life and property in a way that doesn't require our active day-to-day intervention, unless you want to. Many of us on this channel, I believe, are weather and climate geeks, so we'll continue to interact with it. But for everybody else, my sincere hope is that it continues to exist in the background and people can ignore it most of the time, while not ignoring it too much, and without acknowledging just how important it is in our day-to-day lives. So with that, I think I'll close. Good luck if you're participating in the activities surrounding Stand Up for Science today. And when I close this, I'm going to go check on what's going on at the rally in DC through their live stream. So thank you all for joining, and I'll talk to you next time.
Feels like every shift I end up here. It doesn't matter who you are or how many times you try drugs. The tiniest amount of fentanyl can put you in the back of my ambulance. We're saving people from all over LA County. I'm talking young, older, successful. Fentanyl doesn't care about stereotypes. Nobody thinks it can happen to them. But fentanyl is odorless and tasteless. So how would they know?
That's all. You're nerdy. Who are you? I'm sick today. You're not sick. It's just the Midwest. You gotta get something in there. You do. Oh, no, nothing. What the heck? Oh, it,
So,